All right, and I believe we are live now. So, welcome to the Reason and Theology Show. I'm your host, Michael Lofton, joined by Thomas Druschke and also John Loftus and William Albrecht. We're going to be having a debate today, and I'm not going to be able to stay and moderate it, so I'm going to turn it over to Drew to do the moderation. So, Drew, if you want to go ahead and introduce our debaters.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. My name is Drew. I run the channel, The Atheist Reformation. I'm guest hosting here today on Reason and Theology. Our first introductee here will be Mr. William Albrecht. He is a Catholic apologist and accomplished debater, having participated in over 50 live and moderated debates. He has appeared on several radio platforms, including EWTN. He is the author of 2 upcoming books due to be released in early 2020. He also runs the website www.patristicpillars.com. How are you doing today, William?
I'm doing very, very well.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. So what are the names of those 2 books that are coming out next year?
Okay, one of them is a bit of a secret title. I can't reveal that one yet, but the other one is a book on the early church fathers and the way they viewed purgatory in relation to the topic of pain and suffering. So today's topic is a topic that I am very familiar with. And I think that book that I'm going to be releasing on purgatory there's nothing like it out there, because I am actually going to be tackling the topic of pain and suffering in connection with the ancient Christian belief of purgation.
Okay, that sounds actually really interesting. Can't wait to see when those come out, especially to see the secret title revealed to that other book as well. All right, so yes. I'm going to turn over to our interlocutor for Mr. Albrecht today, John Loftus, who is an atheist and is a prolific author and debater, having participated in several live debates. He has authored some of the top-selling books considered essential reading for those who want to learn about atheism, such as Why I Became an Atheist, A Former Preacher Rejects Christianity, The Christian Delusion, Why Faith Fails, Christianity is Not Great, How Faith Fails, How to Defend the Christian Faith, Advice from an Atheist, among many others. He is the founder of the website debunkingchristianity.blogspot.com, and today he is widely considered one of the top atheist apologists in the world. Welcome to the program today, John. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing fine. It's always an honor to be invited to discuss these issues with William and with anyone else that wants to do that.
Excellent. Sounds good. Okay, so let's see. Do you have any new books in the works or anything of that nature?
Oh, I do. I have what I consider that might be my crowning work. It's coming out probably in September or October, called The Case Against Miracles. It's another anthology, and in it we cover a lot of territory, from philosophical issues to apologetic issues, to why people believe in miracles, to the laws of probability and odds, and to several different kinds of miracles that you find in the Christian scriptures. Like we have one on creation written by Abby Hafer on why evolution is a fact, down to stories of the Cana of Galilee, turning water into wine episode, the resurrection, and the coming of Jesus. So it's the return of Jesus. So I consider that to be probably my best work yet, and it's really interesting that even people who read my books say it keeps getting better.
and we're going to be debating in person pretty soon based on that. So that is something I'd like to add that.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to seeing when the new book comes out, Mr. Loftus, and I will probably be trying to pick up a copy myself. So I'd love to take a look at it.
Let me know what you think of it when you get it.
Sure. Will. Maybe I'll do a review on my channel about it. Who knows?
That'd be all right. That'd be awesome.
Okay.
Incredible.
All right. So now we're getting into our debate today. And let's see. I must apologize. I am woefully unprepared for this particular portion of it because I don't think anyone told me what the topic was.
Okay. I'll tell you right away. The topic is whether or not the problem of pain and suffering, or if you want to call it evil and suffering, is compatible with the existence of a good God as described by the Christian theists, I suppose.
Okay, so we're looking into arguments involving the Euthyphro dilemma, sounds like.
Correct. Yeah, pain and suffering. That's pretty much what it is. I believe you do have the format, though, right?
Yes, I do. I do have the format. All right. So, since Mr. Loftus, you will be arguing in the affirmative today. Looks like you have the first say, the opening salvo, so to speak. So I've got a timer set for 10 minutes for this, and if you would like to go ahead and start, let me know, and I'll get that timer going.
Sure. Let's begin.
Okay.
I assume that means you clicked the start timer. Okay. Believers will argue that not even a God could create a world without some minimal level of suffering in it. But what about the amount of horrific suffering that exists? That'll be my focus. Horrific amounts of suffering. Here's the problem. If a God exists who is all-knowing, all-powerful, and perfectly good, then the amount of horrific suffering in our world needs an explanation. Either this God isn't smart enough to eliminate it, or isn't powerful enough to eliminate it, or doesn't care enough to eliminate it. The reason is that an all-knowing God would know how to eliminate it, an all-powerful God has the power to eliminate it, and a perfectly good God would want to eliminate it. So for the sake of the argument, let's just examine such a God, let's just assume such a God exists. Then why did he create something in the first place? Believers typically respond by saying creation was an expression of God's love. But wasn't God already complete in love? If love must be expressed, then God needed to create, which means he lacked something. Well, God decided to create something anyway. Then why didn't God just create a spiritual world in heaven? Believers say a heaven awaits them when they die, where there will be no death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, where believers will have incorruptible bodies in a perfect existence. So why didn't God just create such a perfect existence in the first place? If there's free will in heaven without sin, then God could have created such a world. To say God initially did create such a world, but that there was a satanic rebellion in heaven merely places the problem of suffering back in time. How is it possible for Satan to be in the direct presence of a God who has unlimited power and still desires to rebel against him? That makes Satan out to be suicidal and dumber than a box of rocks to think he could defeat an all-powerful God. Even if this is possible, why didn't a good God squash such a rebellion before it happened so there wouldn't be such horrific suffering? Well, thank you. Well, let's say God decided to create a physical world anyway. Then why did God give us free will? God shouldn't have given us free will if by doing so he knew it would lead to horrific suffering. The giver of a gift is blameworthy if he gives gifts to those whom he knows will terribly abuse those gifts. Any mother who gives a razor blade to a 2-year-old child, for instance, is culpable if that child hurts himself or others with it. Well, let's say God decided to create a physical world with free creatures in it anyway. And what is the purpose of creating such a world? It appears to be a cruel game of hide and seek, where God hides and we must find him, and only the few who find him will be rewarded, while the many who don't are punished when they die. If God has foreknowledge, then why didn't he just foreknow who would find him even before creating them and simply place them in heaven in the first place? Then there'd be no one punished for not finding him. If this world is to teach us the virtues of courage, patience, and generosity in the midst of suffering, then those virtues are irrelevant in the heavenly bliss where there is no suffering or pain. But in creating such a world, this God should have some moral concerns. One, that we don't abuse the freedom God gave us. God should not allow any genocides like the Holocaust, no Joseph Mengele who tortured concentration camp prisoners, no atomic bombs that devastated Hiroshima, no gulags, no 9/11s, no Cambodian children stepping on landmines, no Columbine shootings, no Jeffrey Dahmers, no gang rapes, or brutal slavery. Good mothers give their children more and more freedom to do what they want, so long as they are responsible with their freedom. If children abuse this freedom, their mothers will discipline them by taking away their ability to make these choices. It's that simple. If my mother sat by and did nothing while my older brother beat me to death, and if she had the means to stop him and didn't, then she is morally responsible for letting me die. God should keep us from abusing our freedom. He could have created us with a stronger propensity to dislike doing wrong, just like we have an aversion to drinking motor oil. We can still drink it if we wanted, but it's nauseating. God could also implant thoughts into our heads to prevent us from doing evil. God would have many other means at his disposal. One childhood fatal disease or a heart attack could have killed Hitler and prevented World War II. Timothy McVeigh could have had a flat tire or engine failure while driving to Oklahoma City with that truck bomb. Several of the militants who were going to fly planes into the Twin Towers on 9/11 could have been robbed and beaten by New York thugs. There's a poisonous snake bite could have sent Saddam Hussein to an early grave, averting the Iraq War before it happened. The poison that Saddam Hussein threw on the Kurds and the Zyklon B pellets dropped down the Auschwitz gas chambers could have simply malfunctioned by being miraculously neutralized. Concern 2, that the environment God places us in will not cause us excessive suffering. God should not have allowed any pandemics like the Black Death Plague, which killed 100 million people, the Spanish influenza outbreak, which in 1918 killed 20 million people. There should be no tornadoes, no floods, no hurricanes, no earthquakes, no devastating fires, no volcanic eruptions, no lethal parasites or major diseases like cancer, polio, malaria, pneumonia, or AIDS. There should be no poisonous creatures like the brown recluse spider, and no poisonous plants like you. Eat it and you die within minutes. If God exists and wants us to believe in him, they should have made it a priority to prevent religious diversity by clearly revealing himself in the world. In this way, he'd prevent all religious wars, crusades, inquisitions, and witch burnings. There'd be no religious-motivated suicide bombers, no Muslim terrorists, and no kamikaze pilots. If God exists, he should stop all natural disasters like the 2004 Indonesian tsunami. If God had prevented it, none of us would ever have known he kept it from happening precisely because it didn't happen. Any person who is supposed to be good would be morally obligated to prevent it, especially if all it took was a snap of his omnipotent fingers. If the theist claims natural disasters are the results of sin, the punishments simply do not fit the crimes. God's purported punishments are barbaric compared to our own. We simply put criminals in jail. If God allows these disasters for a greater good, what's the greater good? Any paltry benefits of the victims could have been gained by other means. To say the victims are going to be rewarded in heaven for their sufferings can never morally justify why they suffered in the first place. Otherwise, the final eternal state, even if it's pleasant for them, only compensates them for their sufferings. This same reasoning could justify us torturing anyone, as long as we later compensated them for their sufferings. Concern 3, that our bodies will provide a reasonable measure of well-being for us. God could have created all human beings with one color of skin. There's been too much killing, slavery, and wars because we are not one race with one language. God could have created us with a much stronger immune system such that there'd be no pandemics which have decimated whole populations of people. At the very least, he could have given us the knowledge to cure these diseases the day after he created us, but he didn't even do that. God could have created us with self-regenerating bodies. When we receive a cut, it heals itself over time, as does a sprained ankle or even a broken bone. But why can't an injured spinal cord be made to heal itself, or an amputated leg grow back in a few weeks? If that's all we experience in this world, we wouldn't know any different. We find a lot of things in nature God could have done for us. He could have created us with wings on our back so we could fly to safety if we fell off a cliff, or gills to keep us from drowning. Only if the theist expects very little from such a being can he defend what God has done. Either God isn't smart enough to figure out how to create a good world, or he doesn't have the power to do so, or he just doesn't care. In response, believers would respond by asserting we just cannot fathom God's omniscient ways. But what needs to be shown first is that this God exists, and the empirical evidence of the amount of horrific suffering is as close to a refutation of his existence as we get. For their response cuts both ways. We're told God's knowledge is so far above us that we cannot understand his purposes. But if God is as knowledgeable as claimed, they should know how to create a better world, especially since we can easily suggest how he could have created differently. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Loftus, for that opening. Mr. Albrecht, are you ready, sir?
I sure am.
All right. Your time starts now.
All right. The so-called problem of evil and suffering encompasses many categories, but for the sake of clarity, I will be covering the following today in today's debate. 1, the problem of evil and suffering in terms of moral evil. 2, natural evils. And 3, the problem of evil and suffering in animals. As Sirach 15:14 says, God made man from the beginning and left him in the hand of his own counsel. Ecclesiasticus 15:14 is very, very clear. God created humankind in the beginning, and he left them in the power of their own free choice, their own free will. As the great theologian Ludwig Ott says of the fall of mankind, according to the testimony of Holy Writ, the first man created by God was good in soul and body, as Genesis 1 shows. Sin entered the world through the fall by the sin of our first parents, as Genesis and Romans show. St. Paul in Romans 9:11 directly excluded a pre-corporal fall through sin. For when the children were not yet born, nor had done any good or evil, is what he says. The fathers agreed with his teaching in an almost unanimous manner. The biblical account of the fall through the sin of the first parents is in Genesis 2 and 3. That the first man received a command from God to test his obedience is one truth. The other is that through the temptation of the devil, who took the form of a serpent, he transgressed the divine commandment. And 3, that our first parents were deprived of their original condition of innocence. The later books of Holy Writ confirm this historical interpretation. Wisdom 2 says, but by the envy of the devil, death came into the world. 2 Corinthians 11:3. But I fear lest, as the serpent seduced Eve by subtlety, so your mind should be corrupted and fall away from the simplicity which is Christ. The sin of our first parents was a sin of disobedience. As Romans 5 says, by the disobedience of one man, many were made sinners. And the root of the disobedience is pride. As Tobit 4:14 says, from it, pride, all perdition took its beginning. Pride is the beginning of sin, as Ecclesiasticus 10:15 says. St. Augustine regarded Adam's sin as an inexpressibly great sin. In his published works and public debates, my friend John has called the so-called problem of evil and suffering an embarrassment, a dilemma, and an insurmountable obstacle. I believe that John is correct, only that the dilemma and the obstacle are going to be for his position. I will show how John's greatest arguments are all arguments that abandon the main premise at hand. If we are to tackle the problem of evil and suffering, we must analyze it from the perspective of divine revelation, from the holy teachings of the faith. Because if there is a problem of evil and suffering, as John claims, as many claim, then the problem must stem from an utter contradiction in the faith. Do our sacred sources show an actual problem? Or has the historical text and the greatest philosophers and theologians already tackled this issue? We have already seen how the divine testimonies show that moral evil originated from the fall of mankind. We can see plenty of moral evil in today's society. If I were to go to supper with John and we were to consume copious amounts of alcohol and good food, while a man begging for food pleaded for us to help feed him outside, and we ignored him, we'd find this to be an example of horrendous moral evil. As humans, we have the capacity to help one another. We have the capacity to band together and to do good, to do well. But as Augustine, Irenaeus, and the great Aquinas attest, we allow our pride to triumph. Another issue that John has raised many times, and rightly so, is the issue of natural evils, tsunamis, earthquakes, disasters that occur all over the world. But Genesis 2:4-6 is clear. It seems to show that the earth was already in a disorganized, sort of chaotic state in some way. Genesis 2 talked about a mist going up from the earth, watering the whole face of the ground. The Greek for mist literally meant a flow, as evinced in the same Greek word used in Mark 5:29 and 2 Peter 2:17, showing the antithesis to the true natural meaning of this word, that being of a spring that doesn't release its proper full flow. This text seems to presuppose that there was an existence of some sort of dangerous flooding over the earth. And as we will soon see, this disorganized state also affected and affects the animal kingdom, as was clearly taught by the patristic pillar and doctor, St. Augustine, and the great St. Thomas Aquinas. Human death may have entered the world through the fall, but the disorganized state of the earth and animals dying could have very well been realities pre-fall. This directly leads us into the third pillar that I promised to cover, and that of animal suffering. Pain and suffering, did it exist before the fall? I think a text that is very, very important to examine is Genesis 3:16. To the woman also, he said, I will multiply your sorrows and your conceptions. In sorrow you shall bring forth children, and you shall be under your husband's power, and he shall have dominion over you. Thomas Aquinas was very clear. He believed that God's original creation included animals that killed each other, writing that the nature of animals was not changed by man's sin. The problem of animal suffering has been recognized as having existed even before the fall by the early church. Aquinas focused on this mystery, but he wasn't the first one or the last. Indeed, as anyone knows, Aquinas frequently hearkened to the early fathers, and you can find this as early as the writings of the great Basil the Great, who even went into great detail talking about this issue. So nature, being put in motion, he says, by the one command, passes equally through birth and death in a creature, while it keeps up the succession of times through resemblance to the end. Because it is so that a horse succeeds to a horse, a lion to a lion, and an eagle to an eagle. And while every one of these living beings is preserved by these uninterrupted successions, she directs them to the end of it all. The peculiarities of animals are not destroyed or effaced by any length of time, but forever young, their nature follows its course in time, as though it had been just constituted. Let the earth bring forth creatures. Obedience to this commandment was continued on earth, and there has been a pause. It is the performance of the Creator. He clearly speaks of death in the animal world before the fall. Irenaeus spoke of the animal world being affected by evil in some way. He addressed the condition of the animal universe pre-fall clearly. But what about natural disasters? As John has made a very bold claim before, a very, very bold claim. He has claimed that everything is caused by God, according to Holy Writ. Of course, John doesn't believe in an all-powerful God, but he claims that Christianity and its face, with its holy documents, as they claim are holy, has horrific contradictions, we're told. God must cause all evil, as Christians claim, or as they claim, and then contradict their statements. He says the Bible is clear of this. He even shockingly uses an example of Luke 13. But Luke 13 is very clear, and I'm going to briefly read it. At the very time, there were some present who told them about the Galileans, whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. He asked them, because they're asking Christ, remember, do you think that because these Galileans suffered in this way, they were worse sinners than all other Galileans? Remember, Christ is speaking. No, I tell you. But unless you repent, you will all perish as they did. And then what is even more interesting is he speaks of a natural disaster covered in Holy Writ. Or those 18 who were killed when the tower of Siloam fell on them. Do you think they were worse offenders than all the others living in Jerusalem? No, I tell you. But unless you repent, you will all perish just as they did. He uses two examples, murder and war, and a natural disaster. Was a natural disaster a result of the sin of the people? Christ says no. He then says that these people weren't more vile than all others living in Jerusalem, yet they indeed perished. And if people don't repent before their time has come, they will face the bema seat, the judgment seat of Christ, in a fiery manner. But we've covered three things today. The problem of evil in terms of moral evil, the problem of evil in terms of natural evil, and evil or suffering, if you will, in animals. And we've covered how Sirach says that God made man from the beginning and left man to his own free will. And that is a topic, a theme that we will be covering throughout this whole debate. And that is a theme that is very, very important. And I realize that my opening statement, my time is running out, and I will now yield the rest of my time to my friend John. I look forward to hearing his rebuttal. Thank you, moderator.
Actually, you nailed it right on the head. That was exactly 10 minutes.
Great. Awesome.
All right. Let's see here. Mr. Loftus, are you prepared to offer your 7-minute rebuttal, sir? John and William, are y'all still there?
Yes, I'm here. I think John's breaking up a little bit. I think John, can you hear John, or is that just me here just breaking up?
No, he's breaking up really bad for me too.
Okay. Should I ring you right back, John? It's breaking up a little bit.
Yeah, let's go ahead and try and do that.
Let me bring John right back up.
All right.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and bring him back up.
Okay. Our apologies, folks. Having a slight bit of technical difficulties on one of the debaters' ends. We will get that taken care of and get John back on the line.
All right, you there, John?
Yeah, I am. I'm here.
There we go. Clearly, there you go. I hear you.
All right, welcome back.
Can you hear me good?
Oh yeah, you're going great,
Okay.
sir. All right, so
All right.
Are you ready for your 7-minute rebuttal, John?
I am.
All right, your time
okay,
starts now.
Okay, so what I need to say is that I'm talking about horrendous evils, and what William is doing is saying, well, that's something that's the result of the fall. At least that's what I gather. And natural evil is the result of the fall, including animal suffering and who knows what. The problem with that is it's not going to be accepted by him or anyone who believes the Bible like he does, because the Bible tells you what to believe. I mean, you read it as interpreted by whatever counsels you accept, and that tells you this is how we explain it, and what it is, what the theology is, what the Bible is, what the church does is it's basically just defending the status quo. See, what we have is a world in pain. We have an earth that is at one time was a seething ball of hot molten lava, and it's got its fissures, and it spews forth lava, and the earthquakes are evidence of plate tectonics moving apart. And this is what the earth does, and so then you develop a theology based on the realities. And when it comes to animal suffering, I mean that's part and parcel of the course of life. It's either eat or be eaten in the natural world, and so animal suffering is to be expected given that. So you develop a theology based on it, and you simply put a divine stamp of approval on it that God says, and therefore that's why it is. Well, no, that's concocting a theology based on the realities in order to gain a following and create a religion. Now, I'm not saying people did that intentionally. Sometimes it was not unintentional, but that's what's being done here with William, and that is defending the status quo and not thinking outside the box. Now, to think about outside the box is to do something different, not try to defend what you were raised to believe in your religious culture, but to ask a more important question, and that is, what should we find if there is a perfectly good, omnipotent God? And that's not the question they're asking. They never ask it, and they will say that they're asking that and they're answering it, but that's not actually what they do in practice. What they need to do is they need to ask. Let's see, I got a quote from John F. Kennedy just as proof. President John F. Kennedy, I said, "Ask not what kind of gods." He said, let's paraphrase him, right? Ask not what kind of God should exist given this present world. Ask what kind of world should exist if God exists. And that's what we do, the reasonable people. We're looking at this world and we're asking ourselves, okay, now what kind of God should exist if he is exactly as you say he is, perfectly good, all-knowing, and all-powerful? Well, you wouldn't have this kind of world. You wouldn't have kids who have leukemia and die a short death. You wouldn't have deers that are burnt in the burn alive in the forest. You just wouldn't do that. I mean, we're talking about the horrendous evils now, the easy ones. I'd already made some suggestions on what could have happened to the 911 bombers. They could have been killed along the way to, getting on those planes. A heart attack, simple heart attack. Nobody would be the wiser. That's what a good God would do. That's what an all-powerful God could do. And that's what an omniscient God would know how to do. So I find it nothing but defending the status quo given the evidence of evolution. You see, what we're doing here is we're not quoting the Bible to inform our views. We're asking if the Bible is true. And we're asking whether it comports to the conceptions that you yourself say you have. And when it comes to horrendous suffering, the case is almost closed. I mean, why it isn't closed, I don't understand. But a mother never gives a 2-year-old child a razor blade. Gives her that child the means to cut others up and itself. And when the child is about to cut somebody, the mother intervenes. It's that simple. That's what you would expect of a good, all-powerful, omniscient being. So my answer here is that what we're doing is we're looking at the world and we're examining that world with the conception that they have of an omniscient, perfectly good God, and it doesn't square. I mean, no one punishes people the way God punishes people in the Bible. I mean, that was prior to jail. There was a time when we thought that when somebody did wrong, they were an evil person. Well, now we know that sometimes they do wrong because they have a brain malfunction. Sometimes now we know they do wrong because of the environmental situation. And so we simply have civilized our punishments, and we put them in jail, we put them in prison, and capital punishment is something that's pretty much abhorrent to most of the civilized world now, but not the Bible. The Bible didn't understand that. That means God didn't understand that. And so these punishments, if they are punishments, the earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, whatever, if they're anything to be considered as punishments, they're barbaric. They're pre-civilized. They don't comport to the true conceptions of a perfectly good, omniscient, omnipotent God. And I think I made my case. And horrendous suffering. See, horrendous suffering is what I'm talking about. And I don't see any explanation for that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, John, for that rebuttal. Stopping the time now. You had about 19 seconds left. If you have a final thought you'd like to offer.
Oh, no, that's fine for now. I got some more to say, though. Hopefully I have. I think I've said the essence of what I need to say, yeah.
All right. Sounds great. We'll be getting to additional questions and whatnot in the cross-examination next round. Mr. Albrecht, William, are you ready for your rebuttal, sir?
I sure am, and I will begin whenever you give me the green light.
All right. Time starts now.
Thank you very much for that. That was a very, very, very good opening, John, and a very good rebuttal. I would like to just let the listening audience know, or the watching audience as well, know that I was not raised a Christian. I have not always been a believer. So these questions are questions that I have pondered very, very often as an individual, as somebody who has gone through great amount of suffering in his life. I didn't believe I was prepared to be ready to talk about such a topic until maybe about a couple of years ago. And I understand the frustrations John may have of seeing horrific amounts of suffering, as he says. The issue that a Christian would have would be exactly what is said in Wisdom 1:13, and I direct John to Wisdom 1, because the issue, you're right, is definitely correct. The issue is with horrible suffering, but the issue is, as Wisdom 1 says, for God has not made death, nor does he take pleasure in the destruction of the living. For he created all things that they might be good. Genesis 50 says, you thought evil against me, but God turned it to good. Job says, though he slay me, I will trust in him, but I will maintain mine own ways before him. Colossians 1:24, I now rejoice in my sufferings for your sake, and in my flesh I am completing what is lacking in Christ's afflictions for the sake of his body, the church. The problem with this issue is if we're going to tackle the issue of pain and suffering from the perspective of divine revelation, there is an answer to this problem. The answer is not that it was sent by God. The issue is that we believe in a fall. We believe that evil does not come from God, as Irenaeus and Aquinas called it. They called it a privation, a lack of good. Now, some individuals would be horrified, furious at saying that. But a privation, a lack of good, does not mean that evil doesn't exist. It means that evil is a festering of the lack of grace of God. But John is right. There are horrific amounts of suffering. Why is nothing done? And I would argue that John is wrong. Who is John to say? Who am I to say? Who is anyone to say that the horrific amounts of suffering and pain in the world are never alleviated? Why so much of this? Why, if a perfect God would know how to eliminate it, and a Christian believes that God sent his son to die on the cross to open the gates of heaven, this is a temporary waiting place, if you will. A Christian, even if an atheist wants to deny the veracity of Holy Writ, fine. The fact of the matter is Christians believe this is temporal. This is temporary. We do believe that a perfect God knows how to eliminate pain and suffering, and we do believe that as a result of this fallen and damaged world, that there is a solution to this. Why create anything in the first place? Because as God says, creating things is good. Fashioning bodies is good. Do you remember how the demons reacted at being driven out of some pigs and being driven into the water? They wanted a body. They were dying for a body, because bodies, spiritual, natural, real, tangible bodies, are something so good created by God that even demons desire a habitation like a body. John says there is free will in heaven without sin, says that is ridiculous. We can talk about that more in the cross-examination, because a Christian definitely does believe that you've got free will here on earth, and you definitely have free will even in heaven. There are examples of it. Of course, you don't have free will in the sense of being able to desire sin, but that is the whole point of this earthly existence being a temporal one, and the heavenly one being what we should strive for and desire. We're told that Satan must have been a moron to have been in the presence of an all-powerful God and still rebelling. We need to realize what the Holy Writ says, what the earliest philosophers say. John directed me. He said, if you want to really tackle this issue, read all of these scholars and philosophers. And I got a list of them that he had suggested in his blog. And I got to say to John, they're incredible. But the problem is this. None of them deal with any of the argumentation put forth by those people that actually knew Christ. You can tell me from morning to night that you believe Jesus was a liar or that the Bible is full of lies. But the fact of the matter is, those people that knew Jesus, those that walked the earth with him, those that heard him preach, said things like this: fire and cross and packs of wild beasts, the wrenching of bones, the mangling of limbs, the grinding of my whole body, evil punishments from the devil. They're from the devil. And allow me to be an imitator of the suffering of my God. This is first century Ignatius of Antioch, who knew Jesus, sat and heard him preach, knew the apostles. So you're telling me there is no solution to this issue of this problem of suffering when we've got it all over Holy Writ, and we have it in the post-biblical era? We're being told this is a fallen world. There is a solution, and this is a temporal. Look at it like this. As a great priest, as a great Padre Pio said, I'm sorry, but let's be honest. You could be 50 years old, 70, 80, 90. That's a drop of water in an ocean. Just the other day, you barely learned how to tie your shoes. And you're complaining about a few years of suffering compared to an eternity of heavenly bliss? Really? Why not squash the devil? John asked. Well, we talked about it in the opening. We talked about free will, the fact that God is not a grand puppeteer. God is not a puppet master to where he controls our every movement. That would eliminate free will. Why give us the ability to have rational free will, we're asked? Well, because there would be no possibility of a heavenly existence without free will. We're told about genocides. We're told, why allow 9/11? All these sorts of horrible horrible moral evils, evils that could be prevented, but the blame is put on God. Are you kidding me? Hitler, that's God's fault? Because he was an animal, a barbaric individual? I just find that ridiculous. I really do. I've got 5 seconds before my rebuttal period is over, and I surrender those. I look forward to the cross-examination period. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that wonderful rebuttal, Mr. Albrecht. And if the debaters are ready, we will now move into cross-examination. The first cross-exam period will go to Mr. Loftus. You will have 6 minutes on the clock to cross-examine Mr. Albrecht, and then that will go back and forth pretty much however many times y'all want to. We have 6 set up here, so 3 for each of you. And if more are needed, or if y'all feel y'all need one more round of it, we can certainly do that before moving on to audience questions and answers. All right, Mr. Loftus, are you ready, sir?
Yes, I sure am. I want to reiterate what I had said earlier, and I don't know how much time you give for these questions or what.
We have 6 minutes. Yeah, we can basically we can interact with each other for 6 minutes, and then the timer will ring, and then it's my turn, and we go back and forth like that.
Right. It's just for those 6 minutes you control the conversation, John.
Yes.
I see. That's how that works. Okay.
Yeah, you can. Once I give you an answer, you can ask me another question, or if you don't feel my answers, giving you the correct thing, you can stop me. You can, clarify it like that, kind of like that.
Yeah. Okay. So you had said that people who suffer sometimes they find out later that it was for their good. Listen, that's wait. Come on, that's not acceptable. First off, I have to make a question. First off, it can't be for people who die horrible, torturous deaths. There's no way they can, well, this was for my good. Now if they die and now if they go to hell. But my question is, surely you know that people in time get over things. I don't care if you believe in God or you don't. I don't care what God you believe in. It could be a horrendous thing that happens early in life or midlife. But everyone, all the time, will say, 10, 20 years later, after time flies by, that, you know what, if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't be in this situation right now, and I'm very, very happy. So it's minds. It's our minds that do that with or without a God. Care to comment on that?
Yes, I do care to comment. Thank you very much for that. And I do want to clarify one thing. Perhaps it came off as perhaps different in my opening statement. I agree with you, John. I don't think all suffering is for the better good. You made a very good point, and I'm going to reiterate that point, shockingly for the audience to listen to, because it's true. Not all suffering in this world will lead to a better good. I'll give you an example. Let's say that I am a member of a mafia, and I'm just, killing people left and right and living a horrific life, suffering along the way as I do that. No better good is going to come out of this. But that just proves my point there, John. You're proving my point by making that argumentation. You're right. Not all suffering is for the better good. That is the point of free will. If I were to choose that path in life and live that kind of a life that would not lead to a better good in life, you're right. But that would have been my free will. And that just goes forth to what I pointed out, what the Bible points to, what Holy Writ points to in Sirach 15:14. Not everything in this earth, John. I don't believe everything done in this earth is going to lead to a better good. So you made a good point. I'll give you a point right now. I'll give you an example. Let's say somebody that I love near and dear is suffering, and the suffering eventually is alleviated. And later on down the line, I say, well, you know what? This must have been a miracle done by God. We simply don't know if that is true or not. And our limited, finite, flawed human minds lead us to believe certain things like that. But I agree with you. We could be definitely incorrect in looking at things in retrospect and making comments like that.
I disagree vehemently, but I'm going to move on to talk about another point of yours. And that is that Jesus suffered for all, and so he knows what suffering is, and he's there for us when we suffer. That makes no sense. First off, the atonement makes no sense. I find no rational way to explain why someone must be punished in order to be forgiven. And I don't care if it's somebody else or yourself or your son. No one needs to be punished to be forgiven sins. There's a lot of people who are writing their lives out in jail who are being punished, whereas their victims still refuse to forgive them. There's no relationship between forgiveness and punishment. So your analogy of Jesus suffering, that he did something for us, makes no sense. You want to comment on that?
I definitely want to comment on that, and I disagree, and I think that you maybe perhaps have an incorrect view of the atonement. The issue is this: the way a Christian looks at the atonement is not looking at Jesus Christ suffering on the cross alone. The way a Christian looks at the atonement, John, is looking at the very beginning when suffering first entered the world, death for humanity, which is in Genesis, and immediately we see a fallen world. We see God making reparations immediately, in the sense of when he says right away that the devil is going to be thwarted by a woman, and he speaks about the Messiah in Genesis 3, which is called the first gospel, the proto-evangelium. So if you're going to receive a Messiah, if humanity is fallen and so damaged, the only way this can be basically turned back, if you will, is by a perfect sacrifice. Christ is the only person completely free of sin in Christian thinking. I know you might think it to be a ridiculous kind of view, but only Christ was a perfect man God. Only Christ had two natures, a human nature and a divine nature. Nobody else could have died on that cross. 1 Timothy 2 says he was the perfect mediator, the only one that could have died on the cross for our sins. So we believe he was a perfect sacrifice on the cross, and it would have only taken, it had to have been as a result of the incarnation. That is why we believe the atonement was so important, and that is why we think it's essential, John.
All right. I'll just note that you didn't answer the reasonable question. And
what was that?
Well, how punishment is required by forgiveness. You just quoted Bible and say we believe differently.
Right. I just said that, though. I just said the reason it is required is because the human race is fallen. Sin entered. Death entered.
That's okay. That's okay. Let me move on, because you're not going to answer it in more words, because you didn't answer it.
Maybe not sufficient for you, but I believe I've answered it.
All right. Now, the evidence shows that Adam and Eve could not have existed, at least not in the way as portrayed in the Bible, because genetic data shows no evidence of any human Genetic data show no evidence of any human bottleneck as small as two people. There are simply too many different kinds of genes around for that to be true. There may have been a couple of bottlenecks in the history of our species, but the smallest one, not involving recent colonization, is a bottleneck of roughly 10,000 to 15,000 individuals that occurred between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago.
But when it's his turn, he can continue that question.
Yeah, well, there's no time in the past where there was two individual human beings to be tested. Science has shown that.
But I think your time has run out. So
that's what I was
can ask me that when it's your turn again.
Have to do my hostly duties. All right, so
it would be my turn now, right?
Yes, sir. And your time starts now.
All right, John. In your book, you made a very bold claim. You said, chapter 12, that the early Christians would have condemned modern ones and would have believed that bad things don't just happen, but that God causes them to happen, that God controls them. John, I believe that this flies in the face of what the very first Christians said, their testimonies and what have you. And I'm very curious, can you provide the name of just one Christian that claims that God caused bad things to happen, as you claim in your book?
Oh, well, let me just tell you, this is a question about my memory. So you can probably always win a debate by asking me to remember something. I've written 10 books, and I've written more about the problem of evil than anything. But let me just use Isaiah chapter 45, verse 7.
But that's the Old Testament, though. But that's the Old Testament.
Let me quote it. I create evil. I create evil. Right. And we find in the Old, just stay with me. We find in the Old Testament all kinds of things that God, the God that Christians believe, also sent a lying spirit. We find that God also hardened Pharaoh's heart. We find that in Amos, he's sending all kinds of famines and droughts and what have you. Now, if that's not the same Christian God, then I don't know. I think Christians want to divorce the God of the Old Testament from Jesus. But then when it comes to defining Trinity or incarnation, they'll say, well, no, he's part of the Godhead. And tell me about the Godhead. Well, the Godhead was always completely unified in thought and purpose and mind and deed, but then say that the Old Testament is different. Now, that's just inconsiderate.
I agree. I agree with you. It would be inconsistent and inconsiderate. And
right.
You listed three things. I'll cross-examine you on those later, the chaos, the Pharaoh, and the famines part. But let me hop on back over to that claim. I know you've written a lot in it, but it would be very easy to just name one Christian from the New Testament or in early history. So I'm going to hop right back over to that question because I thought it was a very, very bold claim. You wrote about it on 3 full pages. So I'm going to, before I move to my next question, I just want to...
All right, I got an answer. I have an answer for you.
Let me hear it.
I have an answer. Well, David Griffin and John Hick both think that God does not have the power to make a good world.
John, what year do those individuals live in?
Well, I think this last century, John Hick is the best, the most important philosopher in our century.
They could have been incredible and amazing philosophers, but it doesn't answer the question. Your claim says that the early Christians would have laughed at modern day ones because they believe God caused bad things to happen. I mean, John Hick and these individuals might be incredible philosophers and theologians, but the question is can you name one Christian that made this bold claim that you say in your best-selling book?
Again, this is like taking pot shots at my memory, but there are Christians who do not think that God has meticulous providence. That is, God is I'm looking for it now. I just just one second.
From the New Testament era, I'll broaden it. You can Google it. Let's broaden it. Let's go from the New Testament era. Let's go to the first 10 centuries. I mean, let's go to the first 10 centuries. Which one of them, and remember the question, John, the question's not about Isaiah or I create chaos. And by the way, you don't translate it like that in your book. But the question is, which Christian claims that God caused bad things to happen? Name one.
All right. Again, I don't think your listeners are going to find
God.
I don't think your listeners are going to find this line of reasoning to be.
Well, I find it persuasive because.
All right, John Cobb, David Griffin, John Hick, and when it comes to meticulous providence, we have Bruce Little, William Hasker, Michael Peterson. Evangelicals like Michael Peterson, William Hasker, and Bruce Little deny what is called meticulous providence. In their view, some more suffering is.
John, this is desperation. These aren't early Christians. You said early Christians in your book. These are modern day individuals. And this flies in the face of what you said. You said early Christians would have laughed at modern ones. These are modern ones. So show me one early Christian in the first 1,000 years, if you want, that said that God caused bad things to happen. That was a very bold claim. You've made it a number of times, not just in your book, but in debates. So I'm asking you to provide just one.
I've already answered you. There are Christians who think that God causes bad actions. I've mentioned their names. You don't agree with the names I mentioned. Look them up. You're pursuing a dead end that no one really cares about. No one's going to be convinced that you're right about suffering because I can't remember something.
Well, you cared about it enough to put it in your book.
Well, it's true. Look, the early Christians would laugh at your Christianity. If you don't understand that, then you don't understand the evolutionary development of theology and the evolutionary development of hell, the evolutionary development of the Trinity, the evolutionary development of the church and the Bible, and everything else that goes with it. They would reject your Christianity in total.
John, we could debate the Trinity and hell from morning to night, and you'd lose those debates as well. We're talking about the early Christians, and you haven't been able to name one. You went to
Have you been given more 7 minutes?
Having a chime.
You went to the book of Isaiah.
6 minutes.
In the book of Isaiah, in your book, you say that doesn't mean God creates evil. You say that means God creates chaos. The actual Hebrew and Greek word there doesn't mean evil. You
Ruah.
it yourself.
Ruah. I know the Hebrew word. It means disasters. It's a word for hurricanes. It's a word for tornadoes. It's a word for famines.
Well, a number of different words are used for famines and for all those other words. But
that's one word sums them up. God sends those things on people, and people die when they hit home. A hurricane kills people, and Isaiah 45:7 says that God sends them all. Pat Robertson says so.
Okay, that's my cross-examination time is up. It's your turn now.
Yep, that's what I was chiming in to notify you guys of.
So here's let me just sum up with just
wait. Let the moderator start your time so we can keep track of it.
All right, John, you're good to go.
All right, so here's what just happened. I've painted some broad strokes here. I have painted a picture of a God who is made up in order to create a religion and uses all kinds of realities in life and tries to explain, here's why they happen. And William, William is a gret guy, and he wants to make important points. But what he decides to do is to focus on one sentence of all the things that I've written. He thinks, well, John just doesn't have that memory, and maybe I can hammer home this point right now. It's like a gotcha moment. Now, if anyone thinks that if you compare what's been going on here, that he won something, well, then you're ignorant. Now, ignorant doesn't mean you're stupid. There's a lot of people who are ignorant about lots of things who aren't stupid. They could be the brightest scientists in the world and not know that Plato was Aristotle's student, for instance, or Aristotle was Plato's student.
Right,
but
let me comment on that, because it is your cross-examination time. I wasn't trying. I'll answer that. I'll take it like a question. I wasn't trying to take a pot shot or to catch John off guard. The reason John, consider you a friend, and the reason I brought up that was because that goes on for more than one page in your book. You've brought it up a number of times, and we need to realize the most important thing. When this whole debate is on the problem of pain and suffering. Is there a viable answer in Holy Writ? My argument is that there is a viable answer, and you make a contradictory statement by saying that the viable answer that I'm pointing out to was actually said to the contrary, that early Christians said God caused evil. So I asked you to show me one example. It doesn't cover 1, 2, 3, 5, 600 years. It could have been in the first 1,500 years, which is in the apostolic era, the golden era, and the medieval era.
Right. Okay, so all right, so
one.
Yeah, all right.
One, John.
So go ahead. Anybody thinks that this is an important part of a debate, really, on suffering, regardless.
Because it shows that they believe there was an answer to this problem. You're laughing at it, but Christians believe there was an answer to this problem.
Of course they do. I don't doubt that. Of course they do. Okay. It's just that it makes no sense. My argument is that none of it makes any sense at all.
And my argument is that regardless of whether you think it makes no sense, over 2,000 years worth of testimony had answers to your arguments. They believe it made sense. And in the Bible that you criticize, there is an answer to this problem.
That's not answering anything that I've said so far. I just want it on the record. That is not answering any of the things that I've suggested here today. Now it's my turn, right? It's my turn, right?
Ask me whatever you want. Yes.
All right. What you're doing? Of course, you're going to get some things right. Because you're looking at the same world I look at as an atheist, and as a Hindu does, as a Buddhist, as a Muslim. You're going to get some things right, and you're going to interpret it this way. Now, the Scientologists, they have an answer as well to the problem of evil, and I don't understand it fully, but there are body thetans that inhabit your spine, and you've got to get rid of them or tame them or moderate them. You got to buy these little Thetan meters, and they've got an answer to the same problem that you see. It's just that they concoct it. And what I'm arguing is that your religion is concocted on the realities and saying we have a solution. There's no evidence for this stuff. There's no evidence for an Adam and Eve. There's a bottleneck of 10 to 15,000 people at most about 50,000 to 100,000 years ago. Now, you don't, you want to deny science, but then so does Scientology and so does everybody else, So we have to have...
Right. I see what you're saying. And it's a great point. Your argument is what I think it gets to the heart of the issue. There's so many contradictory statements out there. There's different groups. There's the Hindus, there's the Buddhists, there's the Mormons, there's the Jehovah's Witnesses. This is where I stand, John, and you can look at it. You can Google where I stand. Where I stand is I am quoting Holy Writ, and I'm even telling you, you can take it as a mere human writing, regardless of the fact the answers for this issue are there. And then I'm quoting individuals. You can say Christ was a liar from morning to night, but I'm quoting guys that walked the earth with him, that knew him, that heard him preach, that are giving solutions to this problem. So I don't care what Scientologists say. I'm quoting those that were closest to the time of Christ and pointing out that they believe evil came from the devil. So there is a solution.
This is my time now. You're referring to New Testament documents, are you?
I'm referring to not just the New Testament documents. I'm referring to the New Testament, and I'm approaching it from the point of view of a secular individual. The New Testament and the it's not just yes or no. New Testament and the early apostolic.
You want to use up time, so I have less and less time. That's another tactic, folks.
No, I'm not. I'm recording too, John. New Testament and the early Christian writings.
Well, now see, you don't actually have their testimony, and if you did, it doesn't matter because
John, I can read Ignatius for you, John. That's the year 100, John. I don't know what you're talking about. That's Ignatius from the year 100.
All right, you're just doing talking points here because it's a debate. You're not really interested in the truth.
John. This is an individual historically existed. You can Google him right now, John.
I'm not arguing that Jesus didn't exist here. Now, listen. What you don't have is actual quotes that are verifiable from people. You have four anonymous documents. That the first full document that you have of them is in the 4th century. You have fragments of them prior to then, but a fragment doesn't say what was surrounding that fragment.
John,
don't interrupt me, please. Don't interrupt me.
Right. And you have to ask me a question, though. You have to ask a question.
I will. Mark, the Gospel of Mark was the first one, and you can see quite clearly. I studied the New Testament. I know a lot about the New Testament now and synoptic problem and what have you in John's Gospel. And Mark's Gospel was the one who started the ball rolling. Paul was, of course, the first writer. And what you have is a lot of quotes being made of people we don't even know. We really don't know these people. We don't know who they are, where they were, where they came from, and all kinds of conversations are concocted. And you say, well, we have people saying this, we have people saying that about Jesus. Well, no, we don't. What we actually have is a document, Mark, saying that they said this or they said that. And what I'm saying is we need objective evidence. And here's why. We cannot cross-examine. We cannot cross-examine any of them. Put them on the stand and let's cross-examine. Let's have a debate with them like I'm having now. That's not taking place.
Therein, let me answer that real quickly. Therein is your great problem, John, because in my opening, in my rebuttal, I quoted the Gospels one time. All the other times I went to texts that predate the Gospels. You can toss the Gospels out if you want and use the writings of Paul. We still have the answers to this issue there, John. You can, and I quoted individuals that are post-biblical era, John, that knew the apostles that wrote and still provided insight into this. You can say the Gospels are baloney all you want. We still have early testimony that even if those weren't their names, they still taught what they taught. We have the testimony of Rabbi Akiva. We have the testimony of Tacitus, of Celsus, that all say they taught this thing, even though those individuals were not Christians, John. So you can toss it out all you want. You can say it's baloney writing, but they still wrote this, and they knew Jesus Christ, and they walked the earth, and they talked with him, and they provided a solution to this issue of suffering, John.
There's no solution. You think you've got a solution because that's your religion. It's based on a solution to the reality of life. Just like the scientists have one. Scientologists, this is Hinduism, and the Muslim faith doesn't even have an atonement. They believe, like most rational people, that if you're going to forgive somebody, then you just do it. You don't need to have a sacrifice at all. They're right.
According to Holy Writ, which is what is under scrutiny,
okay,
and according
Bill,
to the
John?
earliest testimonies, there is an answer.
Okay, guys. So we've reached the end of that round of cross-ex. It is time for Bill to go ahead and start your next 6 minutes. Are you ready?
I sure am.
Okay, and starting.
Okay, John. Okay, great. John, in your book, and not just in your book, I've heard it in a number of written debates and live debates, you make a great statement. You say that everyone should read Karl Barth. You say, these are your words. I'm going to quote you because I love your books, John.
I wish I knew where you were quoting from.
Doesn't matter. You've said the same thing like a million times about Karl Barth.
I'd like to see where.
You say Karl Barth is one of the greatest theologians of the past century. You've said it in 2 books of yours. You said it in written debates in your blog. And
that doesn't mean I agree with him.
Okay. You say everyone should read Karl Barth.
At least for starters.
Fantastic. Yet in your same book, when tackling the problem of evil, suffering, and pain, you never cover what he says. So I'm going to ask you this question. Do you agree with your favorite theologian of the past century when he says that evil is nothingness? He goes on to describe evil, as a force that threatens to corrupt and destroy God's creation. And his description of evil is shockingly similar to the Bible, to Irenaeus, Augustine, and all of the early giants of Christendom. Will you agree with what he says about evil?
No, because evil is suffering. Evil is intense, horrific suffering. I've made that clear. That's what the emphasis I want to make, and I think the horrific amount of suffering that there is, that exists in our world, is incompatible with an omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent God. So no. I think that the idea that evil is nothing is a made-up concoction, a theological device, in order to exonerate God from the suffering that's in the world, because we still have the problem of the lack of goodness. I mean, if you want to mince words, then you might want to say, okay, there's no evil, but then why is there so little good? You really have not solved the same problem. You're just using word salad.
Okay, fantastic. Let's move over to the dressing on the word salad then. I'm glad that you don't agree with Karl Barth, who you call the greatest theologian of the past century. I don't agree with all.
I don't think you understand. I wrote my master's thesis on his doctrine of the Word of God.
So, you made another bold statement in terms of Pharaoh, and this was to, I guess, kind of show that God is, I suppose, a tyrant. You said that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, which the Bible does say so. John, are you aware that the original text actually says that Pharaoh hardened his heart first? And that
no. I mean, look. I know that in the text it says both. That's what it says. It says both. But for you to say,
that's it. I mean, my point is you proved my point. And I want to make sure that you're aware that the Bible does show that Pharaoh indeed had free will. You made it sound like only God hardened his heart, that he hadn't done it himself.
Well, so does that mean that God couldn't have softened his will? I mean, you're saying, oh, Pharaoh hardened his will, so God hardened his will more? Because obviously God did harden his will so that he would keep not let Moses' people go, and so that more people would suffer and die. So you're saying that God couldn't soften his heart? I mean,
I'm saying that God does not interfere with our free will, because as the biblical Holy Writ says, we have free will. I'm saying that God does not control individuals like a puppeteer. That is the only thing that I'm saying. You made a bold statement. You said it to me personally before. You said it in debates, and you said it in your book. You brought it up earlier as well. You brought up the issue of plagues and famines. And in your book, you've quoted Exodus 32 to show that God creates evil. And you say that in Exodus 32, that the text says that God sends plagues on people. Do you still believe that?
Well, yeah, I don't have the text before me, the Exodus text, and I don't have my own book before me to say so, but I guess I'll have to play along.
Well, let me go ahead and go over it real quick. As I go over
No, you don't need to. I'll play along.
Okay, you play along. Well, as long as you're playing along.
I'll play nicely sometimes.
Well, I'm going to try and play as nice as can be, because it's an error that I found, and I was actually shocked.
So basically, your whole
John.
slick is to nitpick. Since I've got 10 books out there, I'm sure they're going to have one sentence or two here and there.
No, hold on, John. You don't have 10 books based on the problem of pain and suffering.
I wrote a lot about it.
Well, if you wrote a lot about it, you should have really done deep research, because in Exodus 32, that was one of your main sticking points by claiming.
I have no main sticking point.
Okay, well, you claim that God causes evil, and you say in Exodus 32 that it says that God himself sends a natural disaster. Nowhere in that text does it say that God sends a natural disaster. So let me rephrase my question to you, John. You're trying to make these points by showing that we believe in a tyrannical God, yet there's no example of God sending a natural disaster. I'm just curious where you get this ideology from.
My wife was just talking to me. What was your last sentence?
My last sentence was, where do you get this ideology from? Claiming that God is a tyrannical God in the Bible that sends natural disaster. Remember, John, if we're going to argue about the problem of pain and suffering, we need to look at what Holy Writ says. And
all right. So first off, I'm responding to what Christians say. All right, Pat Robertson says that, and if I were to research further, a lot of others say the same thing. So it's not like I have to educate people on things. All right. So first off, I'm dealing with real people who make real arguments. What you should be doing in this case, if I'm wrong, is like contacting him and debating him, because there are a whole lot of people. Who agree with him. Now, are they stupid?
John,
well, I don't think they're so stupid, because Isaiah 55 says that God sends those disasters. Why do we need anything more? John, why are you the one picking and choosing which Bible passage you want to follow?
John. Isaiah 52 says that chaos is created, not disasters. And secondly,
disasters. It's ruah. The word is ruah. It means disaster. It means hurricanes. It means tornadoes, earthquakes, fires.
You're very wrong. And we can debate for hours on that word. You're wrong, John. I've done research on the way that word is used.
Have you studied Hebrew? Have you studied Hebrew and Greek like I have?
John, I can read Greek.
Can you read
John?
Can you read your lesson in Hebrew? I'll take that as enough.
I know Greek. And the Greek text of that passage predates the Masoretic text, John. So I can take you to school from morning to night on what the Old Testament Greek says. My point is this, John.
We're talking about.
Hold on. My point is this, John.
Gentlemen, I'm
you brought up Pat Robertson.
Whatever.
Okay, go ahead. It's your turn to cross-examine me now.
Yep, time starts now.
Me?
Yes, sir. Go
That's
right
your
ahead.
time. Yes.
I'm not enjoying this. I'm just not enjoying this.
Well, you can't answer my questions, John. You're tongue-tied.
Oh, come on. You're nitpicking me to death.
John, you asked me. Before we debated, John, you asked me.
My wife's enjoying it.
I know she is. She's probably never seen you get beaten so bad, John. John, before we debated, you asked me if I was prepared for this debate, and it looks like one of us was prepared for this debate, because you're tossing out names of guys that I can go to their house and talk to. I want to talk about people that knew Christ, John. I don't want to talk about Pat Robertson, John. Come on, John. If you're going to try to prove your point, talk to me about guys that lived and walked the earth with Christ that prove your point that evil is caused by God. Don't tell me what Pat Robertson teaches, because I don't care about modern-day evangelicals, John.
Well, that's the whole problem. I mean, there's splinters within Christianity, just like there are splinters within religion, and none of them can get it straight. And apparently God didn't know how to communicate such that there wouldn't be these divisions, which caused 8 million Christians to slaughter themselves in the 30 Years War and the 8 French wars of religion. I mean, your God, the one you're defending, the Catholic one, apparently couldn't do anything about the Catholic Church, and it's cover up of molesting priests. I mean, your God.
I'm going to answer that question.
No.
Because I'll take that as a question. It's cross-examination time. I agree with you. There's a huge problem in the church, John, and that is reprehensible. When we talk about molestation, when we talk about horrible scenarios that happen in the church, John, that is reprehensible. But guess what, John? That is not sanctioned by God. That happens by humans. That is human evil, John. And that is something that is spoken against in the Bible. And guess what?
Of course it is.
Hold on.
Yeah.
You're talking about wars? You're talking about horrible things that happened when Hitler rose? Well, John, why don't you talk about Pope Pius XII that saved thousands of Jews? Who are you to say that God didn't intervene for that, John? All you're focusing on is the evil that's happening. Why not focus on perhaps the miracles that occurred? Maybe God intervened there. Why not focus on the good that's happening?
Yeah,
All
I
you're
guess.
doing is focusing on the evil, John. And
Well,
if
that's
there's an answer to that, you're tongue-tied.
I'm trying to offer a balanced position here.
Not none, though,
And
John.
since you have blinded eyes and can't
come on,
see the
John. I've not always been a believer, John, yet I'm providing you with answers in the biblical text. Remember what you told me, John. I consider you a friend, and we talk often. You asked me, are you prepared? You should have been prepared to deal with the text. Because if we're going to talk about the problem of evil and
I have 10 books. I can't remember everything I've said in text. Now listen, it's my
you've not
turn.
written about this topic in 10 books, John.
It's my turn. All right.
Go ahead.
Now, you're here to win a debate.
And I'm going to win the debate, John, because this is based on the Bible.
There's certain tactics that you use. One is dominate the conversation, dominate it with nitpicking, and what have you. But free will, the thing that you're trying to say that God couldn't have changed. I've already given some suggestions as to what God could have done with Timothy McVeigh or the 911 bombers. I'm talking about intensive, massive, ubiquitous suffering, and you with blinded eyes, like a deer caught in the headlights, are doing your best to nitpick.
John,
yeah.
John,
Wait, I don't laugh. I don't laugh and interrupt you with you.
You laughed before the cross-examination began, John. But this is, remember, this is cross-examination.
Yeah, well, you know what? You're not being honest with the facts.
John,
there was no Adam and Eve. That's what the evidence shows.
But John,
your religion is nothing more than a concoction, an evolved concoction of the realities of life.
Remember,
because in the Bible, what you find is slavery embraced.
John,
you have women who are treated as second-class citizens at best.
Okay,
you
John,
have homosexuals they're condemned to die along with witches and people who do not believe, and yet you're defending that God and say, no, we don't believe that anymore.
Let me answer that, John. That's a great. Of
course, you have you have the answers, don't you? You're not asking the questions.
John, what should I do?
You have to ask. You have to think outside the box, and you're unwilling to do that. You've been taught. You've been indoctrinated a certain way, and because you've been indoctrinated a certain way, and you want to rise in the ranks of apologists, you're not interested in an honest dialogue.
John, I don't want to rise through any ranks. I want to give you an honest answer. All I've been doing is giving you honest answers. And when you ask me a question, I'm going to answer it because it's cross-examination time, John. Let me answer that claim that you made. You've made a claim about all sorts of horrible things that happen, about women, about slaves, and what have you.
It's in my book, Christianity is Not Great. Have you read it?
I've read it. I've read all of your books, John. I have them all on Audible as well.
You're blind more than most, then.
I've not always been a Christian, John. I appreciate that compliment. When you say that women are viewed as second-class citizens, John, I'm going to suggest that you open the Bible and read what the Bible says about Mary. Because Mary is the only individual, and she's a woman, that is called full of grace aside from Christ.
Oh, listen, you wouldn't believe, people have treated women bad since Eve's day. And,
it still occurs to this day, John. It still occurs. People are horrible, John. I agree.
No. Eve was blamed for Adam's sin, and you brush over it as if Mary is going to solve that problem, which she didn't.
The moderator's talking.
Hey, William. All right, so we're looking at a potential time constraint down to about noon here. It is 11:25 now. If both debaters are willing, I would like to go ahead and shut off cross-examination and do 5-minute closings for each of you, and then move on to.
Well, I do want my final cross-ex. I'm willing to give away a little bit of my closing time so I can get my final cross-ex. You can lessen it to 4 minutes if you want my cross-ex.
I'll go ahead and lessen it to 3 because that's kind of where I cut John off on this.
No problem.
So we'll do 3 minutes of cross-ex, and if at all possible, if y'all can do 3, maybe 4-minute closings, that'd be perfect.
Well, I don't agree. I don't agree with changing the time format.
Okay, you want me to have my full cross-examination?
I want my 5-minute closing.
Okay, that's fine. 5-minute closing is perfect. We will.
I mean, that's what we had agreed to. Am I correct?
It was initially.
So whatever you have to do with the time, in order for me to get that, then he should have the same time frames, time elements that I do, and should not be given more here or more there.
I just want my final process.
I want to drill down one more William, and then we'll do 5-minute closings.
Okay, John, I mean, it's impossible to cover every single comment that has been made, but in terms of what the Bible says, I know in today's modern day world that Christian people, not just Christians, atheists, secularists, every single kind of individual treats women as second class, horrible individuals. Is it not true, though, that in the Bible that Mary is given the highest status of a regular human being?
Well, in the Catholic faith, eventually, maybe so, but the Catholic faith does not allow women to be priests. At least it hasn't been for millennia. See, here's the reason: because they led Adam into sin, and you know that. So it's
in the Bible. Here's my question. My question is, we can talk about the priesthood later. My question is it true, yes or no, a woman is described in the most elevated status, and that woman is a human. The only other person given the same kind of privileges is Jesus Christ in a higher fashion. Am I correct? Yes or no?
No. I think when it comes to religious faith, the Muslim faith holds women in the highest regard. They don't allow them to come out in public because they revere them. They make them obey their husband because he protects them like no one else, and that there's no other women being more protected than Muslim women. No,
thank you, John.
Your view of women is not like theirs.
John, what you just did.
The secularist view of women is the best of all. We treat them as equal partners in our life,
John,
in our life's journey.
You just inadvertently confirmed what I was asking, because the way the Muslims view Mary is they view her as immaculate and free from sin, the way the Christians do. You just confirmed exactly what I was asking you. While trying to take a pot shot at me, you just confirmed exactly what I was asking you. I want to go and move on to Ignatius of Antioch, John. You said that the gospel writers are insignificant. We don't know who wrote it, whatever. They might have been, crazy people or whatever. Isn't it true, though, John, that we have the names of several individuals that lived and walked the earth and knew Jesus Christ in the post-biblical era, and they spoke about this problem of pain and suffering, and they had an answer? Isn't that true?
You've confused me, but no, it's not true. We don't know. We cannot look. I can't consider anything in the Gospels except hearsay evidence, and hearsay evidence is hearsay because I cannot cross-examine them.
Right. But
and what we have on the one hand are anonymous documents. That's what we have on the one hand. We don't have people. There's no Mary Joseph. There's no Joseph of Arimathea. There is no Judas. What we have is a document. It's over there. It's on the witness stand. We cannot cross-examine it. There's a lot of questions I want to ask each one of those participants, but I can't because they're dead. It's the history of that period is gone. We have no means of treating them other than hearsay, and you would not believe that there was a virgin birth based on the mere testimony. You would want evidence, and we don't have that evidence, so we don't have a Virgin Mary.
Well, John, that is a topic for another debate. The topic of the virgin birth. We are going to debate that in person. So I guess this is a great juicy warm up for that. But okay, I guess my time is up.
Yes, sir. I do apologize. That was a quick 3 minutes. It felt like. All right. So,
no
John,
problem.
Are you ready for your 5-minute closing, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Go ahead. Starting now.
First of all, I get a little irritated when I think that I'm being mistreated and being treated unfairly. But whether that is, people can judge for themselves. Now, I found that Christian apologists are experts at picking and choosing between God's attributes of omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence, depending on the problem to be solved. When it comes to God's omnipotence in the face of so much intense suffering, apologists conveniently negate it by focusing instead on God's omniscience, saying we cannot understand his ways. God, like a father, knows best, they'll say, when it comes to explaining why an omnipotent God allows so much suffering. So in order to save their faith from refutation, they must allow God's omnipotence to go only so far and no farther. This is where his power arbitrarily ends, where the apologist needs it to end in order to solve a problem of faith. When it comes to God's omniscience in the face of so much intense suffering, apologists conveniently negate it by focusing instead on God's omnibenevolence. that God created a perfectly good world despite the fact that doing so meant there was the probability free creatures would disobey. They will claim God didn't know how to create free-willed creatures who never disobey, or at the minimum don't disobey very often, or in such humane ways. So in order to save their faith from refutation, they must allow God's omniscience to go only so far and no farther. This is where his knowledge arbitrarily ends, where the apologist needs it to end to solve a problem for faith. Christian apologists will even negate God's omnibenevolence if that is required to believe. Since there is clear evidence for a great amount of gratuitous suffering in the lives of so many people, suffering that has no ultimate explanation for the individuals who are suffering, Christians will deny what is called meticulous providence. In their view, some of our suffering is because God is not directly involved in our lives. So that's the God I want to believe in, right? That's when horrendous things take place. But according to them, God does not care to be involved in our daily lives. So we suffer as a result. Now, certainly an omniscient God knows how to intervene. Certainly an omnipotent God has the ability to do so. Shouldn't an omnibenevolent God have the motivation to do so? It should be easy for God to eliminate the horrendous suffering in our lives. That's not too much to ask of a truly omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent deity. If you name any specific example of horrendous suffering in this world, I can easily show how such a God could have eliminated it without adversely affecting anything else, since such a deity would be able to perform what I have previously called perpetual miracles. If we accept that God is omnipotent, for instance, and that he created the universe from nothing, then he should be able to perform perpetual miracles. So God could miraculously intervene without us ever knowing he had done so. And let's say he could have stopped the Indonesian tsunami of 2004, which established its fingers, and 250,000 people would not have died, and none of us would be the wiser since it never happened. That the more knowledgeable a person is, the greater the person's moral responsibility to help others who are experiencing horrendous suffering. And if you think of a helpless girl who was being whipped by her plantation owner, we can see clearly that a person who didn't know this was taking place could not have been held morally responsible for not doing anything about it. A person who knew it was taking place but had no power to stop it could not have been morally responsible for not stopping it either. Since God is believed to be both omniscient and omnipotent, he bears the highest possible degree of responsibility to stop it. The best explanation for God not helping that girl or any of us who are intensely suffering is that God isn't omnibenevolent. So in order to save their faith from reputation, Christian apologists must allow God's omnibenevolence to go only so far and no farther. This is where his perfect love ends, where the apologist needs it to end to solve a problem of faith. Now, you can talk about nitpicking all you want, but that's the essence of our dispute, and I don't think William has said anything to dispute that.
Okay, John, are you finished with your closing, sir? Okay. Well, you got about 45 seconds left if you'd like to add a closing thought.
Okay. I appreciate you saying that. Maybe I should put Zoom or something. Maybe
up for me there.
imagine there's no religion, whatever. No, I just don't like how I speak here. He came voting God because I've got so much out there, and he found that he did not answer the social problems I mentioned. So the opening statement, the closing statement, in between, you got to kind of ruffle with it. But let's just leave it there.
Do you want me to begin mine, moderator?
Oh, sorry, I couldn't quite tell where it petered out. It looks like we're having a tiny bit of audio issues again. The last of it tailed off, but it sounds like the gist of everything did come through, Mr. Loftus.
Yes.
So,
I don't know. I can't tell what it did or didn't because I'm on my end. You're on your end.
okay, so right, no, I understand that. All right, so what we're gonna have happen is, if we can, William, can you call John back, see if we can reestablish that connection? Then we'll have you.
Yes, I sure will.
5-minute closing, and we'll go into Q&A. Okay.
Wonderful. Yes. Let me call him back. Call him back. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Here we go.
Okay, John, can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, sounds like the audio is still a little bit choppy. Would you mind saying just a couple more things, just your name a couple of times, see if we can get this thing rolling?
Seems to not be going through. Give me 1 second.
Okay, sure thing. All right, while we're working on that, I'm going to go through and read a couple of these chats here real quick. Look a little bit interesting. Let's see. Looks like Anthony Brooks in the comments saying he's able to nitpick both debaters here and there. Some interesting debates going on in the comments themselves in the live chat between Anthony and CS.
Okay, let me go ahead and go through with my closing. Yeah, and then let me do my closing. You able to hear me okay?
Yes, you're coming through just fine. So let's go ahead and start your closing now.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that, both John and the moderator. I greatly appreciate this opportunity to talk about a topic that is very near and dear and close to my heart. Before we began this debate, John had asked me a question via text. He asked me if I was prepared for this debate, if I was prepared to talk about this topic. And I guess if we could look back to a few years ago or many years back, I would say, you know what, I'm not prepared. But I've gone through a lot in my life, enough to say that I can say that I've gone through pain and suffering, and I can say that I still believe in God stronger today than I have ever believed in God. I've lost a number of loved ones. I've lost my father, who I've seen dead before me in my very eyes. I've lost people that I've loved. I've lost women that I've cared for. I've had issues when it comes to pregnancies, terrible tragedies that have occurred. I've lost another father figure that I loved very near and dear. Right now, as I dialogue with you, my mother is just a little bit far away from, not too far away from me, just having had surgery to alleviate an issue where it seemed like she was going to go into cardiac arrest. I'm not coming at this, as John says, from the perspective of an individual that is brainwashed. I am coming at this from the perspective of somebody that has not always believed, somebody that has not always been a Catholic Christian. Today's debate was on the issue of evil and suffering and whether or not there is a solution for this. I told John, and John agreed, that we would stick to divine Holy Writ, the earliest testimonies. And John wanted to quote guys like Pat Robertson. I can drive over to Pat Robertson's house and talk to him. I don't care what Pat Robertson says. With all due respect, I don't care what modern day evangelical Protestants say. No disrespect. I'm sure they have great things that they've written about. I care about what Matthew, Mark, Luke, John had to say. I care about guys that walk the earth with Jesus. What do they have to say? I care about what they have to say, not about what guys that John has probably talked to over the phone, what they have to say. My authority is sacred text, divine writ, and the testimony of the church. I dealt with John's book, and I was told that I'm using cheap shots. Are you kidding me? Really? Some of John's most important arguments in his books are cheap shots? Are you kidding me? John's written a lot of books. I grant him that. Never has John written a lot of books on this issue. So John should know what he's talking about. John says, well, you don't know how to read the Hebrew. You don't know how to read the Hebrew, John. Are you kidding me? But regardless of the Hebrew, in Isaiah, it does not say God creates evil. I will point to the fact that the text that predates that text is the Septuagint. We can look at what the earliest testimonies of those that examined that text, those that preached that text from the pulpit, None of them interpreted it the way John did. John says, God, if you believe in God, you got to believe that God causes all evil. Why, John? Because God caused free will? Then God is a grand puppeteer? He controls us. He's moving our strings? Come on, John. That's not what we believe. That isn't what the Bible shows. And if we're going to say there's a solution to this problem, we have to deal with what the text says, and it doesn't mean what you show it means in your book. So when you point to passages like Exodus 32, and you say, Exodus 32, look, it says that God sends a natural disaster, guys. No, it doesn't. John opened up the King James English translation, took an outdated word that says plagues, didn't even do research on that word, and he said God sends a natural disaster. Come on, John. If you're going to write a book, do research on what you're saying. He says, I'm taking pot shots. I want to rise through the ranks. I don't want to rise through any ranks, John. Come on, John. I want to deal with what the original text says. And I think the original text shows that there is a solution to this problem. We live in a temporal world. This is temporary, John. If I go through suffering for 50, 60, 70 years, I'll deal with it so I can live in an eternity in the bosom of Jesus Christ, the Trinity and the saints in heaven for an eternity. You don't go through all suffering on earth. John himself has said he's lived a great life. You don't. This is a great world. I've lost a brother. I've lost a father. I've lost an uncle who was a father to me. But when I see my daughter every morning, I know that God's hand is working in my life. Every day, when I see my friends, I talk to my friends, I know that this temporal universe, this fallen world we live in, there's a better place in the afterlife. There is an answer for that. John says you can't cross-examine the writers of the Bible. So what, John? You can look at their testimony. You don't like that? Then look at guys that wrote after the Bible.
Oh, okay.
Okay, my time's up. Sorry about that. I'm sorry if I went over a little bit. I lost track of time.
It was only a couple of seconds. You were doing good. Okay, so John, how is your connection now?
Pretty good, I think.
Awesome. No, you're coming through loud and clear. All right.
Wow,
so
clearer than before. Yeah, that's incredible.
We've
I understand it myself.
We've done our closing arguments. So if y'all don't mind, we'd like to move on to just a few questions. We've got about 15 minutes worth of time. So are y'all ready?
Sure. All right.
Okay. So first question, we're going to go with a question for you, John. This appears to come from actually Michael at Reason and Theology. It says, how can you speak of good or evil without a perfect standard of objective good, which is, as he defines it, as God? And in such a way, do you have to borrow from the Christian worldview to use such language?
Well, first off, there's no Christian worldview. You can look up my blog on that. But to say that anybody borrowed from Christianity, well, Christianity borrowed from their own cultures and the Old Testament cultures and the Mesopotamian culture. There's the laws of Hammurabi, which they predate the Ten Commandments, for instance. So everybody's been borrowing, everybody's been evolving their morality, and there's no difference when they change their morality to include homosexuals. And all of a sudden there's a great big movement now. Christians are embracing homosexuals, which they condemned before and even killed. And Christians embrace slavery and even had their own slaves. So it's, where do I get my morality? Well, I say I get mine in the same place that everyone else does. Do trial and error to see what works, to see what creates the best for my life and the best for those around me. And then it's better if my immediate loved ones live in a good society, so that I want to have a good society so that they can my loved ones, the ones that I treat well, can live in that society and have a well-being, and that's about it, And I want a society without religion, and that's the best kind of society. I don't think it's been achieved yet, but I think that it could be, and if it does, we've seen some of its benefits in Norway and Denmark and the Scandinavian countries, but even in Europe and some places. So morality, it evolves, and it's cultural, all the way down.
Okay. William, would you like to take about 30 seconds or so to address that answer, or would you like me to move on to a question that I have for you?
No, I'll address it. Yeah, and first off, I think it's a great question. I think Michael is really hitting it from the great perspective. I think if we're going to look at morality, really, if we want to look at what good and evil is, you get great examples from the Bible and from the early testimony of the church. I think Michael is making a great point, a great question as well, because if we go throughout church history, we can see horrible, horrible crimes such as slavery, the abuse of women, and what have you. And a little-known fact is the church, from the very beginning, from the very get-go, in church councils and in encyclicals, has spoken out against slavery. Remember, the slavery of the Bible is nothing compared to. It's not the kind of slavery we speak about like kind of African slavery. Very, very different. But even at the very beginning, it is the Christians that have done the most for society in terms of helping, in terms of lending a helping hand, and has always really been there. And I think that the Bible, Holy Writ, and the earliest testimony of those that need Jesus, I think that is a great roadmap that we can follow.
Okay. I'd actually like to ask a small question of you, William. It's something that John actually had in his answer, referring to the Stela of Law, or the Stele of Law, referring to the Code of King Hammurabi, predating Mosaic Law by probably the better part of 1,000 years. What do you have to say about the historicity of the character of Moses in the Bible, particularly since he seems to, at least from a secular standpoint, appear to be a composite character, particularly of Pharaoh Sneferu, Sargon of Akkad, even having some hints of the Epic of Gilgamesh in there?
You got that right.
That is a great question, and I think that'd be a topic for a whole other debate. But I think the way we would have to look at it, and I think the important thing is we need to realize, if we look at the first 5 books, I know I'm going to take maybe a bit of a controversial position. I don't think Moses may have written them himself. Maybe he dictated what was written, or maybe some were even written after he had passed on. I definitely think the message is still the same. I think that maybe you might think, that it is a composite of various characters, because the text, even if we examine the text in the Greek, the Septuagint, because we know the Septuagint text predates the Hebrew, the text that exists, at least. I'm not saying it was originally written in Greek. I'm saying the text that exists to this day. It does seem like different authors did compose those writings. I still think, in regards to the testimony of Moses, what the earliest Jews said, the early historians, even like Josephus, I do believe that Moses was definitely a historical character. I don't think that he was made up, and we have all these other texts that show that this and that was borrowed. I'm gonna make another very controversial statement. I think if we look at the historical witness of a lot of these writings that exist, that have come down to us this day, I think a lot of them have copied off of Christianity, because if you look at a lot of these texts, they don't predate the Christian faith. Maybe they're dated to a time beforehand, but as Justin Martyr says, he makes a really interesting point. He says, hey, these guys are copying us. Well, why would Justin Martyr say that? Why wouldn't he get refuted? I mean, we've got guys that write after him, like Celsus, that could have easily refuted that, but he doesn't get refuted. He says, these guys are copying us. And as we look at it to this day, we look at the ancient testimony, some of these don't predate, like the story of Thor. That has evolved way, way later. We don't even know what the original belief was in regards to that. So I think that's really a question that can really, really be delved in even more. But I don't think that the Old Testament or the New Testament ripped off any ancient stories.
Okay. Well, hey, maybe you and I can have a discussion about historicity at a later date. That sounds like it might be fun.
I'd love to.
Okay.
Definitely.
So now I actually have a question for William. This also comes from Michael at Reason and Theology. Again, for William, how can a good God create anything or create a person knowing some will go to hell? For instance, most fathers would not make their children if they knew in advance that they would go to hell for their life. So what kind of an answer do you have for that?
I think that is one of the most important questions. And that gets to the heart of the issue. Why would an all-loving God, if we believe in an all-loving God, why create somebody, even if they have free will, if we know that they are going to be damned? I'm going to tell you the way Holy Writ and the way the earliest testimonies and the way Thomas Aquinas answered that. The reason is because of this. Because regardless of the fact that we have free will, an individual that has all of the faculties has the ability to choose what is right or wrong. We don't believe that a mentally retarded individual will be damned because that individual doesn't have the faculties to accept God in the best of their capacity. Remember, I don't think Joe Schmo, homeless guy down the street, needs to believe in the Nicene Creed to get to heaven. I don't believe that. So depending on the faculties of the individual, I don't believe an individual can be born into this world. Like I can tell you right now, I'm not telling you definitively that my friend John is going to go to hell. I don't believe that. I don't believe that. I cannot definitively make a statement that is up to the hand of God. But I can say one thing very clear. For an individual that goes to hell, they have chosen that route themselves. They have not said, oh, well, you know what, I just lived. I lived, sometimes I was good, sometimes I was bad. No, this person has to willingly, knowingly reject God to his face and choose hell, which is the reality of eternal damnation. And as horrible as that may sound, I know a number of modern-day theologians reject that belief, but that is a belief of ancient testimony. I only believe that that is a special case for individuals that reject God to his face, and I do believe that we have the free will to accept God or knowingly and willingly reject God.
Okay. John, would you care to take a 30, 45-second response to that, or would you like me to move on to another question?
Yeah, I think it's one of the most horrific types of things that Christians believe. I'm glad to see William has moderated his view. That's what Christians and the church has always done. Their theology has evolved, and now you got who is that? Ryan Bell, is it? Who says that everybody's going to be saved, and you got the process theologians. You have universalists because the doctrine of hell is just too horrific. So of course you're going to moderate it and say, well, no, we don't really believe what Jonathan Edwards said about God holding us over hell like a spider, and it's just too horrific. And no matter how the conception of hell, it's just too horrific. Even loneliness, eternal loneliness, has been proven. Solitary confinement has been proven to be quite horrendous. So no, as a father, I've got a son that has done wrong things, and I would never, under any circumstances, want to even spank him at this point. 30 years old. I would just put my arm around him and love him and care for him and help him to do better. It's just ridiculous to think that there's some kind of an infinite God who cannot understand that when we do sin, we're not doing an infinite wrong. We're only doing what we think is best based on our genetic environment and genetics and environment. And most all of us, except for the deranged, and they don't count. The psychopaths and the sociopaths, their brain has malfunction. The rest of us, we all do what we think is best at the time. We might regret it later, but usually the regrets are the pain caused, and that's enough, and it should be enough for people who want to learn and grow. So, no, hell is just horrific. It renders the idea of a perfectly good God just ridiculous.
Okay, thank you for that, John. All right, so looks like we have a question actually for you, John, from Chatter CS. He asks, why does this atheist find the death penalty barbaric? What inherent value does a human life have to him?
Well, I think that there's been enough. I think some of it is because we know that a lot of the people on death row have been minorities in America, blacks, and we also know that DNA evidence is exonerating some of them, and so it gives those people a chance and to be free once again. Another thing is the death is quite horrific. Is the evidence convincing enough to send somebody to the death chamber? We're just looking at pain and suffering and saying just what's best for society, because if we stand up for the less fortunate, then we might be actually standing up for ourselves, because someday we might be, charged, or our loved ones charged and sentenced to death, and we don't want that to happen to us either.
Okay. I actually find that I kind of agree with you a little bit on that one, but more of mine, I guess, someone could consider this from a brutally utilitarian aspect of it. I actually have a background in working in corrections in the state of Texas, and
Wow.
and so my issues with the death penalty actually more have an issue of cost more than anything else. It actually costs more to execute an offender after conviction, given all the appeals and everything, than it actually is to just imprison them for life. So
I didn't know that.
So at that point, which would you find would be a more humane? And I guess that question could go to both of you. Which would you find is more humane at that point for that offender? Would be to execute or life imprisonment? They die in custody either way.
Well, I'm not here to ask that. I mean, I know that some people do hang themselves when they're in jail or in prison, or they shoot themselves rather than be arrested. So I guess they've made their choice there. I'm not one to pontificate, I guess, if you will, on what's more humane. But I think that in one sense, all human life should be valued simply because I'm human and I want my life valued. And I guess that's all I can say.
Okay. William, if you'd like to answer that question, you're more than welcome to. You've got about maybe 45 seconds to a minute before we have to kind of wind things down and shut off the stream.
Sure. Okay. Let me try to. I'll give my opinion. Really, it's just an opinion. And I'll be honest. I've never really done a lot of deep thinking on it. If you ask me what my position of the death penalty would be, it's really a tough one. Because from one perspective, I truly believe that only God can give and take life. But then if, and I would say if, and I know that Clement of Alexandria in the 2nd century touched upon this, what if there is a risk of locking up an individual like, let me give you an extreme example, Chapo. Anybody knows who Chapo is. You have to, living in Texas or living anywhere, you know who Chapo is. What if there is not the ability to find a maximum security place like there is in Colorado for him? What if you can only put him in a place like, let's say, in Del Rio? You know where Del Rio is, tiny little place, tiny little holding cell. Mm-hmm. What if there's a massive risk? What if you're basically told, guess what? Chapo's going to be out in a few days. There's really nothing we can do about it. That then brings into question, maybe the death penalty would be permissible in that sense if you know he's going to get out and cause the deaths of many, many more innocent individuals. It's a really, really tough topic, but something that we can ponder later on in time.
Okay. Well, in my opinion, anyone who says God alone has the authority to take someone's life is someone I oppose vehemently, because in the history of all life taking, it's that God never does anything. People do. People who say they've heard God do. People who've read sacred texts do. It's people who kill people, not God. And so anyone who says that God alone can kill people, God alone can execute capital punishment, I'm opposed. I'm opposed to that, and that brings me all kinds of emotions when I'm thinking about capital punishment too, because I'm pretty sure.
John's right. John is right. John is right. A lot of people have used God as an excuse to murder innocent people. And if people say, I hear God talking to me, that's why I'm doing this, there clearly is a problem with that. To a certain extent, I agree with John.
Okay. All right. Well, guys, thank you both for this wonderful debate. Again, everybody, John Loftus, author of 10 books at this point. And would you like to put a little bit of a plug in or list a method for people to contact if they have additional questions for you?
It's been nice being here.
All right. It was nice having you here too. Again, everybody, William Albrecht on patristicpillars.com. For those who may not know how to spell that, that is PATRISTIC pillars.com. William, is there any other way that people can get a hold of you should they have additional questions?
Yeah, they can actually go to my Facebook page as well, facebook.com /Catholicos, KATHOLIKOS. That's Catholic and Greek, and they can find out about any upcoming talk or any upcoming debate that I've got going on, and that'll lead them to my website as well, where I've got a lot of stuff and a lot of free debates they can download, they can hear.
So you know, your readers, your listeners know where to contact me. I don't know if you asked me that question earlier. My wife's been commenting. She's appreciated this debate. But at the blog Debunking Christianity, just put those words in a Google search. You'll find me, and then my name on Amazon, John W. Loftus, and you'll find several of my books. Most of them, probably not all of them.
All right. That sounds great, John. And William, thank you again for participating in this debate today. Look forward to seeing more from both of you, and I will try and tune into that live debate if they decide to host that on YouTube or somewhere live where I can watch it.
They definitely will.
All right. Thank you, guys. Have a wonderful day. I've been your guest host
very much.
for the Atheist Reformation on the Reason and Theology channel. Have a great day, guys.